Hello, welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Morose and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Paulson de Brisay, MNRM student at the Natural Resources Institute at the University of Manitoba, will be talking about disentangling mechanisms to mitigate effects on grassland songbirds. Every month, PCAP asks someone to present either in the form of a webinar or an in-person talk in a Saskatchewan community on anything to do with native prairie conservation or species at risk. Stay tuned for our upcoming Native Prairie Speaker Series. On June 12th, Julie Heinrich, research scientist from the Computational Ecology Group Canada, Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory, Colorado State University, will be talking about comparing the population benefits of habitat restoration options, greater sage grouse in Alberta. So check out the PCAP website for more information or to register for that webinar. I would like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by Canada North Environmental Services, Environment and Climate Change Canada, Eco-Friendly Sask, Information Services Corporation, Ranchers Stewardship Alliance Inc., SaskTel, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. In-kind support for today's webinar has been given by the University of Manitoba. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation. Questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. Now, a bit about our presenter. Paulson de Brisay received his BSc in Zoology at the University of Guelph in 2012, completing his honors thesis, which examined the ambiguity of species limits using mitochondrial DNA in a cryptic, widespread ant, left him with an interest in factors that cause some species to not follow the rules. Such species-specific responses can reduce the effectiveness of conservation efforts to mitigate the impacts of anthropogenic disturbance. His current master's research at the Natural Resources Institute is focused on applying methods from conservation physiology to determine why similar species may react differently to disturbance by looking settlement patterns, body condition, and glucocorticoids stress hormones in grassland songbirds in response to oil development. So if you're there, Paulson, you're welcome to go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I need to accept my screen sharing. Hopefully this works. Great. Okay, yes, hello. My name's Paul, or Paulson, and I'm going to be presenting on a whole whack of stuff. Let me get in presenter mode here. Great. So this is it's gonna take me a second to get used to the fact here that I can't hear or see anyone, so I will have no idea if you're enjoying my my talk or not. I'm going to assume that you are all laughing at all my jokes and everything. So let me, hold on, get out of there. No, I don't want to install that right now. Of course, this always happens. Okay, going. Perfect. So there we go. So what I'm going to be talking about today is actually not just my work. So if you look at all those names across the bottom of the screen, there's easily 12 contributing authors to this presentation, and it's sort of been evolving over the last year into what will eventually be a finished picture of this, what I've titled The Little Oil Well on the Prairie. So we're getting very close, but you'll see when I get to the end of the presentation that we don't have the final answers to all of our questions. So yeah, I just want to acknowledge all the graduate students and postdocs who have helped out with gathering these data and helping interpret all the cool signals that we're getting. So I'm going to be talking about the mixed grass prairie region of Alberta. So this is where I've done all of my work. I've been out there for 4 summers now, and this is one of our typical control sites. So it's very flat. It's completely native mixed grass prairie. And it's essentially, we work on pretty much a community pasture. It's actually run by the Eastern Irrigation District in the area of Brooks, Alberta. So this is all actively grazed pasture, which is fantastic. And so this is what it looks like when there's no oil wells. But the major, other than the ranching, the major economic activity that happens on these lands is oil and gas development. But native prairie in general, I'm sure that most of the people who are currently listening don't need me to tell them that it's one of the most endangered habitat types. And given that it's a very endangered habitat type, it follows that the inhabitants of that habitat are also some of the most imperiled organisms. So this is a graph that's put out by the World Wildlife Fund, their Living Planet Index. And grassland birds in Canada are the group that's suffering the worst sort of historical decline. So since we started measuring these things in the 1970s, grassland birds as a guild have been on the decline, their population sizes. And this is for a number of reasons. So if we look at this aerial image, you can see that there's native prairie, which is kind of that gray mosaic there, and then agriculture, which tends to be irrigated. So there's canals put in for it. There's fences put up, and it changes the plant communities entirely. And so this is considered habitat loss. That prairie is gone. And then to access all of those sites, you end up needing roads. And while a road itself might be pretty benign, you can see in this photo, I think that's buffalo bean, perhaps. But it changes the way plants are distributed. So when you have cars driving through, they move seeds all over the place, and you get these really drastically different distributions of host plants, which changes how animals use the environment. And then more recently, oil and gas development, so just pure energy extraction, has really started to take to make its mark on the landscape. And this is what we as a lab group, so our lab group is advised by Dr. Nicola Coper at the University of Manitoba. And this is what she's been interested in for a long time, and where we've sort of built our research around is these oil infrastructure. And so this is what one of our sites typically looks like. You've got, I can point, can't I? Maybe. Give mouse, no. Oh, no. Maybe I can, maybe I can't. Maybe it's not worth it. Oh, never mind. So this is one of our typical sites. So you can see the road going across that site, and the oil well actually is pretty hard to see from this aerial image. It's just a little box there. So the physical disturbance is relatively small compared to something like agriculture that really changes the landscape. So given that the physical impact of an oil well is relatively limited, we really wanted to know, okay, are songbird communities actually responding to these minimal physical impacts? So we do our work here. Those red smears on the map just shows the number of oil wells per square kilometer. And so you can see that the area of Brooks, Alberta that we work in generally actually has more than 5 oil wells drilled per square kilometer of habitat. So while the physical disturbance is small, there's lots of it. The things to know about the effects of oil wells on grassland songbirds is that when we started this in 2012, there was surprisingly little known. So what we wanted to do first was know, okay, what happens to the abundance? So, are grassland songbirds still using habitat that are close to oil wells? what happens to their nesting success, and do they change their behavior? And to do this, we actually looked at multiple types of, oh, it's gonna keep doing that, isn't it? Multiple types of oil wells. So there's your standard pump jack oil well that's in the top right corner there. And those are the ones that kind of look like a drinking bird. And then there's the screw pump oil well, the one in the bottom right. And it's actually much smaller, but they emit different noise frequencies, and they move differently, and they're different heights. So they look different to a bird who's potentially assessing the habitat in that area. And they actually power them in two different ways as well. So you can have one of these oil wells hooked up to a power grid and have it powered by electricity, or you can actually have a propane generator running the oil well. And so that also changes the noise it emits and the physical infrastructure around it to support that oil well. Too far. No, there we go. So we went out and we did surveys just for abundance of birds around these around two types of oil wells and around just fields with no oil wells in them. And the response in terms of whether birds were actually using the habitat was really mixed for these different species. So Sprague's pipits on the far left there, they avoided any sites that had oil infrastructure on them. There were fewer Sprague's pipits observed anytime there was oil infrastructure there. And the same was true of Baird sparrow. Chestnut-collared longspur, however, didn't seem to care if there was an oil well there or not. They would use that site just fine. The same was true of western meadowlark, and savanna sparrows were actually much more abundant across the board. So they were just the species we saw most of. Anyone who's been out on the prairie, I'm sure you've heard savanna sparrows. But they also didn't care if there was physical infrastructure on there. So already we're seeing this, that not all these bird species are responding the same, which of course piques my interest, because what's driving the difference in these, in the ways the birds are responding. And interestingly, there was also no difference across the board here about whether the oil well was active or whether it was inactive. So it wasn't the human activity or the noise that was driving these overall trends in abundance. It was actually the physical oil well that was there. So the next thing we wanted to know was if having an oil well on the landscape or a road or a power line, does that affect nest success? So are birds still able to lay eggs, have them hatch, and leave the nest successfully? So we went out and we did some rope dragging. You can see two technicians here. They have a large rope in between them, and there's some aluminum cans with rocks on the inside. And you walk along with that in between you, sort of jangling along the ground. And when you scare a bird off its nest, you can find, you're sort of always watching that line, and you find the bird's nest, and then we can monitor it to know whether or not the nestlings survive or not. And this is completely safe. We've never had the rope or cans damage a nest. The grass is actually strong enough to protect them. And we did this for a bunch of different species. You can see they're very easy to tell apart. So there's savanna sparrow, vesper sparrow, chestnut-collared longspur, western meadowlark, and Sprague's pipits. And it's sort of always a challenge when you find one of these small nests with a small brown bird coming off of it. Sometimes it takes multiple attempts to figure out which species you're actually monitoring. So when we actually look at the results for nest success, one trend really falls out, and that's that the screw pump, so that smaller infrastructure that's actually a newer technology, seems to be reducing nest success more than other types of infrastructure. So the white bars are fields with no oil wells on them, and the black bars are with pump jacks, the speckledy bars are screw pumps, and the stripy bars are a compressor station, which actually is a very loud station that compresses natural gas to send it through lines. And so it's kind of strange that across, when you combine all those different species we were looking at, that this one infrastructure type actually fell out as having a different impact than two other types of infrastructure. When we look specifically at savanna sparrows, so these were by far the most abundant nests that we found. Another really striking thing that fell out is that the different ways that infrastructure are powered really affect the probability of the nests in that general area surviving. So nests that were beside oil wells that were powered by the power grid were much less likely to survive than if they were powered by a propane generator. So the generator powered sites are in the white bars, and the grid powered sites are the black bars with the lowered probability of survival. This was really striking and actually a little bit it's very surprising. One of the hypotheses for this that we have is that the grid powered oil wells tend to just be more connected, so there's more roads and they have power lines going to them, which increases the habitat for potential nest predators. So things like a merlin or a crow can use power lines to perch on and potentially look for nests. So that's on some ongoing research. And again, we can see that the effect of the oil well on nest success was not specific to whether the oil well was actually running or whether the oil well had been turned off. So when I talk about inactive oil wells, generally I'm actually referring to wells that have sort of reached the end of their productive life, and so the oil company has turned them off, and they have a certain number of years to decommission that oil well. And so in that time period, we can look to see if an oil well that is not even pumping oil has an effect. And generally what we see is that these effects are similar whether they're working or not, which is also a little bit shocking. So these two broad metrics, the abundance and the nest success, they came together to produce these series of maps, which Jody Daniel, this is her master's research, and she's much more qualified to talk about this stuff than I am. But the take-home message here is that when you combine, so these are, the darker areas of these maps are areas where either abundance is high or nesting success is high or clutch size is high. And the really striking thing is when you overlay the most positive metrics for these, or the most positive areas for these three different metrics for these two species, savanna sparrow and chestnut-collared longspur, you don't actually get everything lining up. So the areas where chestnut-collared longspurs, for example, are most abundant may not be the areas, or in this case are not the areas where nesting success, where clutch size is highest. So it really illustrates that depending on what you use to ask, are oil wells good or are oil wells bad, or are roads good or roads bad, the metric you use really matters, and that it changes your conclusion. So when we saw all these different species-specific effects and all of these, the way that different metrics affect our conclusions, we really decided that we needed to go more into the mechanisms behind these things and try and tease out why different species were acting differently and what we might be able to change to make these sort of maps line up a bit better. So again, we're talking about these two different types of oil well, and when we look at the map, of course, the oil well, it doesn't take up much habitat, but there's something I've mentioned a little bit about, and that's noise. So the oil wells are making noise, and that noise travels very easily over the flat landscape of the prairies. So if an animal is close to a noise point source, I mean, you can imagine if you're at a rock concert or something, rock music, there can be straight up hearing damage or hearing loss, but chances are, a bird's going to fly away if it's in a noise that's that strong. But simply having a hum over your constant daily life is going to change your behavior a little bit. It's going to potentially affect your mating or your foraging behavior or your ability to communicate. And we know that it potentially changes some of these things like abundance or predator-prey interactions. If you can't hear your prey moving through the grass, you're not going to be a very effective predator necessarily. And so noise has the potential to be very, very important in this system and affect things like survival, fecundity, and clutch size, which are important fitness metrics. There you go, fitness. So when we overlay what the noise looks like onto a landscape with oil wells, it really changes your perspective for how these infrastructure might be impacting the landscape. So here are two different types of oil infrastructures, the ones we've been talking about, the screw pumps and the pump jacks, and they're receiving different power sources. So the one that has the two that have a smaller area that the noise is actually audible for are actually the grid-powered screw pump and pump jack. So those are the smaller circles. The bigger circles are the ones that are powered by a generator. So right off the bat, it was a little bit strange that the grid-powered oil wells were the ones that were showing lower nest success. Now, there's different effects that noise can have, and the more opaque, smaller circles there, that's where the noise is actually masking some of the information content for the birds. So if a bird is within that opaque circle, it has the potential that the bird will actually not be able to hear potentially important signals, either calls from its buddies, or calls from a predator, or simply if it's foraging in the grass, it might not hear rustling or something like that because the noise is too loud. The more translucent circles, the larger ones, that's the area that the noise might be causing interference with other signals. So it's kind of like if you're in traffic, you might be able to still hear your friend talking, but you're missing a lot of what they're saying because the noise is interfering with your ability to interpret that signal properly. So noise can be really, really important here. So that's what we decided to focus on for the last about 5 years that we've been doing this work. And really our question has been, are there effects of noise on grassland songbirds specifically, and can we mitigate those effects by reducing the noise? So Nikki likes this slide because she sort of makes me put it into any presentations that I do when I'm talking about this experiment. Because what we did is we made these noise playbacks. And so the only way to be sure that the effects are caused by noise and not confounding factors is to use playbacks, where you play noise without the physical infrastructure there. They're essential for determining whether reducing noise will contribute to conservation. So we designed and implemented the world's largest noise playback experiment. This is the one I'm going to be talking about. It's the only experiment to compare the effect of noise from different types of infrastructure to help us understand what types of noise have more impacts. And it's the best way to determine the effects of anthropogenic noise, specifically on abundance and productivity, parental behavior, survival of adults and fledglings, nest predator communities, and stress levels of the birds. So what did we do? We went and we took recordings of these 3 types of oil infrastructure. So the 2 I've been talking about, pump jacks and screw pumps, but we also wanted to know if the noise from the louder process of actually installing these oil wells, the drilling noise, we wanted to know what the impact of that was as well. So we made recordings of these 3 infrastructure types at various distances from the infrastructure. Yes, you can see our little recording devices there. And then we designed and we built and confirmed the sound fidelity of some solar broadcasting systems. So you can see they're powered by what are actually, I think, golf cart batteries. We install them out in the prairies, and they have two big speakers in there hooked up to the batteries, and they're powered by these solar panels. So this is what they look like when they're totally set up. This is in early spring, so before most of the birds have actually arrived. And they play the noise of the oil well into a field 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the entire breeding season, which is the upkeep of them is actually a little bit trying at times, but we've been doing it for as I said, this is our 6th season of running these infrastructure now. So I won't go into this too much. Suffice it to say that we replicated this a lot of times with these 3 different noise types. And because the playback infrastructure actually ended up looking so big on the landscape, we added some playback infrastructure that were not playing anything back. They were simply silent, and they were sitting there looking like the speaker housing with the solar panels, but not actually making any noise. And we compared what was happening in these fields with the noise playback to a bunch of control sites, so sites that had nothing going on in them whatsoever. We've actually monitored now over 1,200 nests of birds across our site types. We've taken corticosterone samples, so blood samples from over 150 nestlings and over 300 adults, and we've now deployed about 100 radio tags on fledglings, and this work is all continuing on this summer. And so I'm going to be telling you a little bit about all the information that we've gathered from these various studies. So the first thing we looked at was that the same abundance trends for the birds around those playback units, and we actually found that pretty much all birds species that we looked at, they did avoid the noisy or noisiest sites. So when you specifically isolate for noise, we do see negative effects, except for the last one there is the Vesper sparrow that actually was attracted to the silent infrastructure. I think they like to use them as a singing perch. But reproductive success didn't always match those, whether or not they should have avoided it. So chestnut-collared longspurs avoided some noisy sites, but their reproductive success wasn't actually lower at those sites. So they were avoiding habitat that should have been actually okay. Savannah sparrow, they avoided the loudest site, those drilling playback sites, and their nest success was actually lower there. So they were doing a good job of avoiding habitat that reduced their nesting success. Sprague's pipits, they avoided literally everything. So the same way with the real infrastructure, we saw them avoiding all types of oil wells. They actually avoided our playback units, and they avoided our silent infrastructure. Basically, if it's taller than a blade of grass, Sprague's pipits don't like it. And their nesting success was marginally lower at those sites as well. So it's possible that they were actually doing that for good reason, but it was hard for us to measure that. And then the Savannah sparrows, actually we saw lower nesting success at those silent infrastructure sites that they were using. So they had the opposite problem of chestnut-collared longspur. They were using sites that actually reduced their nesting success. Right, so this is what I just said. They avoided suitable habitat, selected suitable habitat, failed to detect what the cue was that perhaps potentially lowered it. But again, that was hard to measure for Sprague's pipit, and selected detrimental habitat for Vesper sparrow. So again, we're getting completely inconsistent responses from these 4 species that we looked at once we isolated for noise. And really, okay, this is just a graphic representation of what I just went through, and I'm going to skip it. So we wanted to know then, we wanted to go past nest success. So nest success is a really coarse measurement for productivity of birds, And really, if one fledgling fledges from a nest, or one nestling fledges from the nest, or leaves the nest, we would consider that nest successful. But if there were 4 nestlings in a nest, like this picture here, and only one of them left, while we would consider that a successful nest, from the bird's perspective, it might not actually have been that successful. So really, we need to start looking at some nestling-specific measurements to see if we can detect a different effect of noise. So we know nestlings are vulnerable to changes in parental care because they need parental care for thermoregulation, to keep them warm overnight, to keep them cool in the day. They provide them with food before they leave the nest and for about 2 weeks after they leave the nest, and potential protection from predators. I've actually seen adult birds dive bombing ground squirrels if they come too close to their nest, which is really incredible that they would provide that amount of protection. And of course, without the parents' help, they're very vulnerable to environmental conditions. And even with the parents' help, something like heavy rain or hail or a thunderstorm could be very detrimental. So the first thing we did was we actually put out nest cameras because we wanted to be able to document parental behavior and potentially predator communities. So we put the cameras out on these nests and watched them move through the stages of nesting, and then we're able to determine from the footage whether the nest actually survived, how many of the nestlings fledged, or if something came in and ate them. So one thing that really jumped out at us when we started analyzing the data from the video cameras is that the parents change their behavior significantly when they're in the presence of either an oil well or a road. So we did this actually around real oil wells and around our noisy sites. And so what we found was that in the graph in the top there shows that the amount of time that mothers spend off the nest. So when a bird's incubating, they don't sit for 24 hours a day on the nest. They leave the nest periodically. And when the birds were closer to roads or oil wells, they spent longer off the nest. So the nest was unattended for longer. During the nestling period, which is the graph on the right, you can actually see that the number of minutes per hour that birds spent attending their nestlings, so feeding them, cleaning up their poop, brooding them, so on, that was lower during or when they were close to noisy infrastructure. And the males also visited and fed the females less when they were close to infrastructure, noisy infrastructure. So for all the nests that we videotaped, when they were by something noisy, they incubated the nest slightly less. They spend less time taking care of their babies, and the males spend less time taking care of the females while they incubate. So immediately we were like, okay, this could be really significant and could have something to do with nest success. Oh, and we know that it affected the fledging. So the nestlings actually fledged. This is showing you close to a road, but the results were fairly consistent that they fledged at an older age and fewer nestlings fledged when you were close to anything noisy. So why are the adults changing their behavior? This became the obvious question. And this is where I come in. So this is when I started my study. And I was really interested in corticosterone, which is a hormone that it's basically the stress hormone, or the hormone that's in charge of fight or flight. So mammals have this as well. It's cortisol in mammals. So in all vertebrate species, this hormone really, it controls a lot of behavior and influences metabolism. And in general, it's just for maintaining homeostasis, or just your body's ability to do its thing in a comfortable way. But when you get stressed out, like if you were to get in a fender bender, your adrenaline levels go through the roof. But your adrenaline can only sustain you for so long. And so when you have to deal with, waiting for the police to arrive and writing up your reports and exchanging information and all that stuff. Adrenaline's not actually helpful for you in that situation, but cortisol will be, because it diverts energy away from things you don't need to do at that time, like think about reproduction in the case of a bird. So it's a really, really important hormone, and we think that there's a lot of evidence to show that the amount of disturbance that an animal or a human or anything is facing will affect the levels of cortisol or corticosterone in the blood, and that should indicate how well an animal is dealing with that disturbance. So this is what I set out to do, was to actually start capturing the birds to look for signs of stress, basically. And I had a lot of help along the way. It was a very involved process, but I will not get into that too much. So the first thing I wanted to point out is, just like everything else we've looked at where species are not responding the same way, you can see here that the corticosterone that I found in chestnut collared longspurs in that red box was much lower than the corticosterone I found in Baird sparrows or savanna sparrows. So immediately, the conclusion you could come to is that, well, Baird sparrows and savanna sparrows, if they have more corticosterone, they must be reacting more strongly to that disturbance, and therefore they're more stressed out. But the problem here is that these birds are related to each other in a different way. So the chestnut collared longspur is in a family of birds called Calcaridae. They're the longspurs. They're in the same family as snow buntings. And the Baird sparrow and savanna sparrow are in the family Passerellidae, which are all the sparrows that you can find in North and South America. And so really what we're looking at here is that the sparrows have certain levels of corticosterone that are different than the longspurs. So, and one of the reasons that this is really important is that if we look back here, the chestnut collared longspur had lower stress, I say in quotation marks, stress levels than the sparrows. But if we look, the chestnut collared longspur is actually a threatened species. It's been declining for about 7% per year since 1970. Whereas the Baird sparrow and savanna sparrow are special concern and least concern, so generally lower levels of decline. So it would be very strange if the two sparrow species that were doing better in the grasslands were more stressed out than the chestnut collared longspur. So really what we're looking at in these data is phylogeny sort of holding over. Which is pretty interesting. When we look at what corticosterone can tell us about how they respond to noise. So here I actually was catching birds that were close to noise sources, or I was catching birds that were very far away from noise sources. And these lines are very, very messy, which is kind of the nature of corticosterone data. It tends to not be very clean. But two patterns fell out here. And on the left-hand side, these are data from female chestnut collared longspurs. And they had higher corticosterone when they were closer to one type of oil well. And male chestnut collared or male savanna sparrows, so a different species, had higher corticosterone levels when they were close to a different type of infrastructure. So I am seeing changes in these stress hormones in birds that are close to infrastructure, but they're not consistent in what type of infrastructure the different species are responding to. But super cool. So this is specifically for those female chestnut collared longspurs. The two responses to the oil well, the actual noisy oil well, and the noise playback infrastructure that we built. So no oil well in the field, just the speakers playing the noise. The response that I saw in corticosterone for female chestnut collared longspurs was exactly the same between just the noisy playback and the actual oil infrastructure itself. So we have pretty clear evidence that at least certain members of these grassland songbirds are responding specifically to the noise emitted by oil wells. So we did the same thing with nestlings, these cute little guys. We looked at their growth and their corticosterone in response to these noisy playbacks. And we found a little bit of evidence here that that certain types of noise might slow down the growth of both chestnut-collared longspurs and savanna sparrows, but these were very weak signals and were not consistent across noise types. And when we look at the corticosterone data from them, this was just presented by a colleague of mine actually at a conference in Tucson. These are even messier lines than my other graphs, and she found absolutely no correlation between the corticosterone levels of nestlings and how far away their nest was from any type of noise. So the nestlings, in their first about 10 days of life, they did not seem to be responding to any type of human-produced noise on the landscape, which is really interesting. So one question, a follow-up question we did ask is how does maternal, so the mother's hormones, how do they affect the hormones of the nestlings? And we actually found a very strong correlation between those two things. So while the nestlings didn't care about noise, if the mother had a stronger stress response to the noise, the nestlings would actually have a higher baseline level of stress. So whether that is the females depositing some of those stress hormones into the eggs, or potentially changing their behavior in a way that that caused the nestlings, like if the mothers change their behavior to feed less frequently, which we have video evidence that they do, it's potential that it's not the noise itself impacting the nestlings, it's the mother's behavior impacting the nestlings. And this is an ongoing area of questioning, of research that we're doing right now. And this is super cool. This is the really cutting edge stuff. Oh, sorry, that's the next slide. Nestling natal environment has less influence, the mother's has more, which I just said. So this is the stuff that's happening right now. There's actually a field crew out in Brooks doing Hannah Carey's second field season of her master's is doing this stuff right now. So she's taking it one step further and saying, okay, when the nestlings leave the nest, what's their survival like? And so she's putting radio tags on the nestlings when they're just about to leave the nest, and then radio tracking them and figuring out if they live or die and what exactly happens to them. So you can see a radio telemetry antenna on the top of a painter's pole on the in the picture on the bottom right there. And that's, if a bird makes it farther than you can easily pick up, the painter's pole helps you get it higher, which is kind of typical biological fieldwork solution. And then the map there on the left, the first point at the very top of that map is where the bird first left its nest, and it does its thing for about 10 days before we found it dead across the other side of the road. So it's probable that an aerial predator picked it up because there actually is a power line right along that road. So that's an example of the kind of data that we're getting. But the really shocking thing, is it going to let me advance to the next slide? Maybe. It appears to be stuck. Oh, there we go. Oh, right. So here's some examples of the things that we find. So this nestling actually died of exposure. So there was a cold rainstorm one night, and we found him like this in the morning. Oh my, the slides are advancing so slowly here. This one had this one was decapitated by a predator. I shouldn't be laughing. I'm sorry. It's just when you follow like 100 of these birds, it becomes a little tiresome to see them all not making it. Okay, so this one was right outside of a ground squirrel burrow. We got next here. Sorry for how slowly these slides are advancing. This one you can see a ground squirrel has chewed through or some sort of predator has chewed through the attachment point for the radio harness, and the nestling was completely gone. So we just found the harness that had kind of been chewed off of the nestling. And I think there's one more picture here. So this one, we were actually radio tracking a snake for several days until the snake pooped out the radio tag and the remnants of the bird. So there's definitely a wide variety of predators that are eating these fledglings. So it's really, really interesting to start getting these data, and we'll keep getting them this summer. But the super shocking thing is that the daily survival of these fledglings so far in our data set is actually lowest in the sites that don't have any oil infrastructure in them. So it's the complete opposite trend to everything else we've found so far. At our noisy sites and at our sites with real oil wells, the daily probability of survival for these fledglings is actually higher than at a site with no oil infrastructure on it whatsoever. So it's really possible that, or highly probable that the predator communities that eat the nests versus the predator communities that eat the fledglings are very different and are responding to these to noise on the landscape in a different way, which is affecting these two different metrics of survival. Okay, where am I at here? Got a little bit of time left. But okay, so I'm probably only going to have time to just mention this because we're getting low on time. But this is actually a comic that was produced for us by Pineapples and Whales, which is a science communication blog. So if you guys if anyone's listening and is interested, Pineapples and Whales, look them up. They sort of summarize research papers from all sorts of fields, and they make them into these accessible little cartoons. And so the other avenue that I'm actually not going to have time to talk about in this presentation that we've been working on, specifically to do with noise, is the communication of birds. So while we've been focusing a lot of time on these measures of abundance and productivity and stress and nestling growth and survival, the other avenue that this research really has taken is this idea of noise impacting birds' abilities to communicate. And so we recently published a paper where we showed that savanna sparrows and bear sparrows actually change their songs in response to oil well noise. And so they actually sing louder and they sing their notes in a more in a cleaner way to try and help pierce through that noise. And it's just really cool that there's all these ways that these birds are trying to continue to live their lives even in the presence of this noise. Yeah, so check out Pineapples and Whales. They're super cool. And I'm actually going to run through most of these slides. I have a whole section on communication that I'm going to leave out, so don't mind me just going through these slides. Okay, so to summarize the stuff that I actually was able to talk about, so we've had these playback infrastructure on the landscape now for about 6 years, and we've been comparing the impact of just the noise with real infrastructure And what we found is that we found a lot of species-specific effects that tend to be neutral or negative on nesting success. So rarely, in fact, we have yet to find a single instance where nest success was better in the presence of noise. So it's always either neutral or a negative effect. So thankfully, we haven't found anything good from noise, because that would not have good conservation implications. However, so far, that's for nest success. For fledgling survival, we actually have found positive effects of both noise and real infrastructure. But I emphasize with these many asterisks, that research is still in progress. But so far, it actually appears that fledglings may gain some sort of shelter when they're beside some noisy infrastructure that might keep certain predators away. That's still an active area of research. We found species-specific neutral or negative impacts of noise on nestling size and corticosterone. So the negative effects are pretty weak. And it really seems like the nestlings themselves are much more dependent on the behavior of the parents. So the nests are such an isolated little microcosm that they're really much more dependent on what the parents are up to than on the environmental conditions themselves, except of course just being straight up eaten by a predator. Parents have less to do with that, but the actual conditions in the nest are really determined by the parent. And we found species-specific, again, effects of noise on adult corticosterone. And really, what I'm struggling with as I write the last chapter of my thesis is how to contextualize those corticosterone results. Are we seeing something that's negative? Are we seeing a signal of a way that these birds are able to adapt to their new conditions? And I'm really going through the literature trying to figure out, without knowing sort of the whole entire lives of these birds, can we use corticosterone to say something about how they feel about oil wells? And I'm hoping the answer is yes. So noise from oil infrastructure sometimes negatively influences nesting success, nestlings growth, stress, and other factors sometimes. The greatest effects that we saw happened to be, or from noise specifically, was from the drilling noise, which was the loudest. It's intermittent, so it only happens for about a 10-day period, so it's harder to adapt to. Because it's loud and it's only there for a short period of time, compared to an oil well or one of our playbacks that's there constantly. Birds might be able to adapt to that. But really, using these landscape scale experiments are essential to help us identify the reasons why infrastructure affect wildlife. So allowing us to identify is the key here. We're getting very close to having a really holistic picture of exactly what the physical presence of an infrastructure does, what having infrastructure with associated roads does, what the specific noise coming from infrastructure does. And while you can tell from my presentation that there's still a lot of ambiguity, the amount of data and the quality of the data that we've been collecting, I believe we're very close to having the information we need to determine a really effective mitigation strategy, assuming that we can actually get people to listen to us. So what's next? The big question in my mind, now that we have all these data, is oil development actually driving the declines in songbirds that we're seeing? So when we think back to that very first graph I showed you with grassland songbirds declining, you know, how much can we attribute, how much of that decline can we attribute to oil development? And from noise specifically, is quieter better? We thought we had the answer to that until we started seeing some of the fledgling survival results. And if it is, how much better is it? And then how much does it cost to make oil wells quieter, and can we convince the companies that are producing these oil wells to spend that money to make them quieter, or to build oil wells in a pattern that reduces the amount of noise on the landscape, or reduces the amount of roads associated with them. So thank you for listening to me ramble at you. Again, I want to emphasize that what the work that I showed you is really a culmination of over a dozen graduate students, 2 postdoctoral fellows. I skipped over a whole postdoc's work, actually. Countless field technicians, bioacoustic technicians over seasons of work. The landowners, Eastern Irrigation District that gives us access to the land, and all the people that have provided money to the project and continue to provide money to the project. And I have probably about anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes to take questions.
Thank you very much for the presentation. That was really, really interesting. If any of our listeners out there have any questions, please feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard. There's one here right now. One of our listeners is wondering what species of snake was preying on the fledglings.
Oh, that's a great question. So it was actually just a garter snake, a plains garter snake. And we knew they ate nestlings. One of my technicians a couple years ago was actually doing a nest check, was looking in to see if the nestlings were still alive, and one of them started to slip out of the back of the nest, and she was very confused until she realized that a snake was literally dragging it out of the nest as she watched. So we knew that they ate nestlings that were still in the nest, but it was a real surprise that a garter snake was able to actually capture a bird that was still less than a week old, but it had left the nest several days prior. So it was a fairly mobile individual, and the snake was still able to catch it.
Wow. Wow, it's amazing that one of your technicians was able to see that. Wow.
Yeah.
It doesn't look like we have any more questions at the moment, so I'd just like to let our listeners know that when you leave this webinar, you'll receive an email with a quick questionnaire. If you don't mind filling it out, it'll just take a minute, and this lets PCAP keep our Native Prairie Speaker Series going. If you're interested in other PCAP events, please check out our website, www.pcap-sk.org, and just click on Communications and Native Prairie Speaker Series. A listener named Benjamin would like to know, is there going to be further analysis of the sounds produced by the screw pump, pump jack, and compressor? It was very surprising that a compressor would not cause more adverse effects than a screw pump.
Yeah, so the compressor noise, we did not replicate that noise with our playback experiments. The main reason being they're actually so loud that we weren't able to get that noise, the power of that noise in a small enough sort of container, or a cheap enough container to be able to afford to build multiple playback units of them, because the compressor station is really, really loud. And when you combine so really the only work we've done with the compressor stations themselves was with the abundance and the nest success early on. And one of the reasons I think that the compressor station didn't come out as more impactful is because the avoidance of those really, really loud sites just made that we found fewer nests, just straight up fewer nests in those areas. So our power to detect some of those effects was lower from a statistical perspective. So yeah, I mean, the compressor station noise specifically is an area that we have not done as much work on as the other noise types. I know Aaron Bain's lab at the University of Alberta, they do a lot of work with compressor station noise in the boreal forest. So it's a very different songbird community there, but his lab, if you want to look up any work by Aaron Bain, you may be familiar with it already. But they've done some interesting work with compressor stations. But the work that we've done comparing the screw pump and the pump jack noise, so the pump jack noise is a little bit lower frequency, and the screw pump noise is a little bit higher frequency. So the screw pump noise doesn't travel as far, but it's much more interfering with the exact range of most of these birds' songs. So a lot of the focus that we've done on the noise difference between those two infrastructure types has been with the communication, and we have found differences in the way that the birds change their songs in response to those two infrastructure types, and their ability to interpret the songs of other individuals from those two infrastructure types. But it's on the whole, if I was to sort of circle back and try and answer your question as simply as possible, it's really surprising how similar the effects of the different noise types are, compared to how different the effects are of having it grid powered versus generator powered, and that's mostly for the nest success stuff. Being grid powered really seems to reduce nest success for a bunch of species, and I think it's because of those having power lines to it and having it sort of be more connected. You can imagine the ones that are powered by generators are usually further from other disturbances, so that could be something to do with it.
Thank you for that answer. A listener named Heather, Benjamin also says thanks too. A listener named Heather would like to know, do you know how Baird sparrows reacted to silent playback stations versus noisy playback stations?
Yeah, so Baird sparrows seem, unlike Sprague's pipits, Baird sparrows seem to be specifically deterred by noise itself. They're a species that's kind of hard to study because both Baird sparrows and grasshopper sparrows are much more transient in our study area. So the chestnut-collared longspurs and the savanna sparrows are always there on the sites that they're present. But the grasshopper sparrows and the Baird sparrows, they some years there's lots of them, some years there are almost none of them. So they're a little bit hard to study. But what we have seen from them is they tend to avoid all real infrastructure. So whether it's an inactive infrastructure, a screw pump, a pump jack, a compressor station, they avoid that. When we put out the playback units that play constantly, they'll tend to avoid those as well. But when we broadcast the drilling noise for just 10 days, they don't leave. So if there are Baird sparrow in a field that we have a playback infrastructure ready to go, and then when we simulate a drilling event for just a 10-day period, the Baird sparrows will stay. And around silent infrastructure, they'll stay. Like they stay around shallow gas wells as well. So any of like the low-lying quiet infrastructure, they seem to be okay with. And once they're already like established on a territory, the noise doesn't seem to disrupt them too much. But anything that's like playing noise or even just like very tall and moving on the landscape, when they first arrive, that seems to be when it really deters them.
Thank you for that. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure, yeah.
A listener named Kim would like to know, is it feasible to combine the population parameters that have been collected at present to perform some kind of population viability analysis or model population changes for each species and compare differences amongst the various infrastructure sites? Are there key data missing for this?
Yeah, so that's become a pretty high priority. And I showed two maps fairly early on Jody Daniel did those maps, and she was using really the coarse data, just nest success, clutch size, and abundance. And that was done. She did that for about 5 or 6 different species, but really we were missing a lot of the information we needed for true vital rates, because there was no information about how many nestlings actually fledged, what the survival of those fledglings were, and what the overwintering and migratory return rates of those fledglings were. So we now have a really good handle for Savannah sparrow and chestnut collared longspur, what the productivity is in terms of producing nestlings. And by the end of this season, we'll have a good idea just for chestnut collared longspur about post-fledgling survival. So we're getting close. We're very close for chestnut collared longspur. We're getting closer for some of the other species. In general, these data are really expensive to collect. But the big piece, so yes, there is a plan to use those data appropriately to start really getting a good idea of vital rates. And I mean, that's the only way to answer that question of, are oil wells driving these declines? Well, we need to crunch the numbers on these vital rates to know the answer to that question. But the big piece that's missing is we have very, very poor understanding of both yearling and adult survival during migration and survival on the wintering grounds. And the reason is that we have very low return rates for our banded birds. And we don't know if that's simply driven by low site fidelity or if it's being driven by low survival. It's unlikely it's being driven by low survival, I think, because if you look at the breeding bird survey data, the area that we're working in is supposed to be a very good area for chestnut collared longspur. So unless we're some sort of like mega population sink, which the numbers for nest or like productivity don't really add up for that either. So I'm guessing that site fidelity is just low, and that's why we're getting such low return rates. But what that means is we have a really hard time getting an estimate of what we think migratory and overwinter survival is. So that's the key piece that we're missing. And we have geolocator data in partnership with the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies and the World Wildlife Fund, actually for grasshopper sparrow, Baird sparrow, and chestnut collared longspur. But we're talking about 5 or 6 individuals. So it's, we're really missing the big pieces: migratory connectivity and the overwinter survival to do a full annual cycle analysis. Great question.
Thank you for that answer. I think that's all the time we have for today. There's one comment here. It says, "Thanks, Paul," from Chris. I don't know if you know Chris, but he says thank you.
It might be Chris Singh.
Okay. So thank you very much for the presentation. To all of our listeners out there, thank you for tuning in. This session is being recorded and will be uploaded to the PCAP YouTube channel later today. And that's youtube.com/user/skpcap. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.